Good morning, class. This is the ECON 512 Introduction to International Trade class. Today is this February 15th, Tuesday. Class will cover the second of Chapter 5 of your textbook. So this week, we discuss the extension of Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, and main topic is the gravity equation and cost of a trade. So the topic of today's discussion are 1. The gravity equation and cost of a trade. 2. The Rybczynski theorem. 3. Trade, investment, and migration as a substitute. 5. Trade and variety. 6. Application of Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. So here are the video clips.
Now let's consider some brief theoretical points on how trade, investment, and migration can be substitutes for each other. In a lot of international economics, there are 3 core mechanisms. The first is trade in goods, the second is movement of capital, in some cases called outsourcing, and the third is migration of labor. The point here simply is that we need to keep all 3 in mind at once. Having all 3 of these mechanisms may limit the ability of politicians to control economies. For instance, let's say that tariffs go up. That may indeed restrict imports, but in response, foreign investment will go up too. So if you consider the 1980s, the United States placed restrictions on Japanese automobiles coming into the United States, implicit import quotas, and the response is that the Japanese built automobile factories in the American states of Kentucky and Tennessee. This may have been a more costly or inefficient response, but still it meant that the initial trade restrictions didn't actually have such a major impact on longer-term automobile prices in the United States. Or here's another mechanism of potential substitution. Let's say, for instance, that policymakers decide to limit immigration into their country. Well, if fewer immigrants come, what then happens is that outsourcing is likely to go up. So, for instance, if the United States takes in fewer engineers from India, it's more likely the case those engineers will stay in India, produce something in India, and then sell it using information technology to the United States. In other words, simply limiting immigration does not necessarily restrict foreign competition as much as it may seem at first. Policymakers may also try to limit outsourcing. For instance, take the case of Indian call centers. Now, this is arguably the policy change that's hardest to implement. It's very difficult to stop people from trading over the Internet, but just as a thought experiment, imagine that we can to some extent limit outsourcing to India. One longer-term response would be that Indian immigration, including immigration to the United States, would go up, and of course some of this may include illegal immigration. So again, there are many levers in international economics, and this includes the movement of goods, the movement of capital, and also the movement of people. And these multiple levers will limit the powers of policymakers. For instance, wages are higher in the United States than in India. Over time, this wage differential can be reduced by, again, movement of goods, movement of capital, or movement of people. These multiple levers make it harder for policymakers to reduce the narrowing of the wage differential over time.
Today we're going to look at the benefits of product variety and the effect of international trade on variety. People are different. Tastes differ. even for a good as simple as peanut butter. Some people like crunchy peanut butter. Other people like it smooth. Some people like it salty. Other people prefer it sweet. We can think about welfare as declining the further away a good is from a person's tastes, in some kind of taste space. So more goods means that a person is more likely to find a good which is closer or closest to their particular type of taste. So variety can bring a lot of benefits. Of course, variety can sometimes also be a little bit confusing or overwhelming, especially if it's a good for which we don't care much about. Some people don't even care much about peanut butter, so the variety of peanut butter can be a little bit overwhelming. But usually, variety is a small price to pay in order to better match our taste with products. More products, more variety, is also beneficial for producer goods, for intermediate goods. These are some goods from orthopedic surgery, for example. A long time ago, we used to just use, a hammer and chisel. Now we have more specialized, more designed goods, which are more specific and more tailored to a particular job, and that increases productivity. So more variety means closer to a person's tastes, and more variety means higher productivity for a particular task. So why can't consumers and producers have exactly their most desired good? The reason is that for many goods, there are economies of scale, and this means there's a trade-off between variety and average cost. So for many goods, the cost of producing the good falls the greater the number of goods which are produced. The cost per unit, or the average cost, falls the greater the quantity produced. So this means that if every individual had exactly the good which they most desired, the average cost would be very high. Instead, we accept a trade-off. We produce fewer varieties. Each one of those varieties, we produce a greater quantity, pushing the average cost down. One of the great benefits of international trade is it makes the trade-off between variety and average cost easier to bear. We can get more variety at lower cost. I'm going to give a simple example from Militz and Treffler. Let's build this example with some assumptions. Suppose it takes 4 workers to design an automobile, and once designed, let's suppose it takes 1 worker to build an automobile. There are 2 countries, and each country has 12 workers. So let's look at one of these countries. It's got 12 workers. What are the things that country can produce? What are the production possibilities for the country with 12 workers? So, assume now there's no trade. Well, one thing a country could do is have 4 workers to design a single automobile, then have 8 workers producing automobiles, so you end up with 8 automobiles of one type of variety. Another thing you could do is to have 2 sets of 4 designers. Remember, it takes 4 workers to design an automobile. So that'll get you 2 designs. Then you've got 4 workers left over, so you can have 2 units of each designer, 2 units of 2 varieties. Okay. Now, what can we do with trade? Well, with trade, suppose we do the following. We now have we'll look at both countries. Let's suppose each country specializes. Country 1 has the green specialization, and their 4 workers produce 1 variety, of which they then produce 8 units of that variety. The other, the blues, their 4 workers design 1 variety, and they produce 8 units of that variety. So far, it's the same situation as A, this situation here. But now with trade, suppose that they trade 4 units of one variety for 4 units of the other variety. What ends up to be the case then? Each country has 8 units of 2 varieties. So notice that with trade, the countries are better off. So compared to situation A, in which there was 8 units of one variety, each country now has 8 units of 2 varieties. Compared with situation B, in which there were 2 units of 2 varieties, that is 4 units overall, we now have 4 units of 2 varieties, that is 8 units overall. So we've got, compared to one situation, we've got more variety. Compared to the other situation, we've got more units. Either way, we are better off. Big advantage of international trade, increases variety. So I cheated a little bit on the last slide, and I want to say how. I showed you on the last slide that international trade could lead to a better trade-off between variety and average cost, could get us more variety at lower average cost. But I didn't provide a mechanism for how markets would make that happen. I didn't show you how the free market could or would lead to that particular outcome. And this turns out to be quite a difficult problem. So when lots of firms have these declining average cost curves, it turns out to be quite difficult to figure out how the market will trade off variety with average cost, how the market process will result in that particular outcome. There are, in fact, a variety of theories along these lines. All fall under the title of monopolistic competition. By the way, Paul Krugman, who did pioneering work in this area, sometimes it said, well, what did Paul Krugman get the Nobel Prize for? And people say, well, he got it for showing that international trade also has the benefit of providing lots of variety. And people would say, well, what was so hard about that? Who didn't know that? You get more variety when you import goods. Well, that's only partially true. What he really did was to show how the economics of monopolistic competition would lead to a process such that international trade would generate you a better variety average cost trade-off. He explained how the market process would work. That turned out to be quite a difficult problem, which is why he got the Nobel Prize for it. The mathematics are quite complicated. I'm going to give you some of the intuition in a later slide. Here's another interesting point about globalization and variety. I've said that globalization increases variety, but actually globalization reduces geographic variety. More places start to look the same at the same time as it increases preference variety, or the variety actually available to individuals. Let's go back to our earlier example. Suppose we have no trade and we have these two countries. Well, now a traveler, a tourist, going from the green country to the blue country will say, look how different they do things here. They're blue here and my home country is green. And a blue traveler going to the green country will say, wow, look how different things are here. They've got green here. In my own country, they've got blue. But remember what trade does. With international trade, you've got a swap of blues and greens, and now a traveler going from one country to the other will say, well, they've got blues and greens here just like they have in my home country. So geographic variety declines. However, for people, for individuals, every individual in the world now has greater access to variety. And that's really what we care about. We care not that places are different, but that people have access to many different tastes and experiences. By the way, Tyler Cowen made this very clearly in his excellent book, In Praise of Commercial Culture. Tyler pointed out that what globalization does is it brings KFC to China at the same time as there are great Chinese restaurants in the United States. So China and the United States begin to look a little bit more similar, even though Chinese and Americans both benefit from globalization bringing greater variety to their countries. Some estimates have been made of the benefits to increase variety, and they turn out to be quite substantial. So from 1972 to 2001, the number of product varieties imported into the United States increased by a factor of 3. And by one calculation, consumers would be willing to pay 2.6% of their income to buy in the larger 2001 supermarket than from the smaller 1972 supermarket. 2.6% of their income just from more variety. That's pretty big. And remember, increased variety also benefits producers by giving them access to tools which are more precisely tuned to exactly the job that they want to do. So it increases productivity. This has been less well estimated, but I think it's also important in my view. Okay, here's some further readings, most of which can easily be found on the web. This is Paul Krugman's 1979 piece, Increasing Returns, Monopolistic Competition in International Trade. It's the piece which made Krugman's reputation and was a foundation for a lot of his Nobel Prize work. An excellent review of some of this material is in Militz and Daniel Treffler, Gains from Trade When Firms Matter. You can find that free on the web. It's from the Journal of Economic Perspectives. It's a very accessible paper. Estimating the gains from more product variety, Broda and Weinstein. Quite a difficult paper, but a worthwhile one to read. And of course, don't forget Tyler Cowen's excellent book, In Praise of Commercial Culture. Many good reasons to read that book. Thanks.
The Heckscher-Ohlin HO model generalizes the Ricardian model by adding another factor of production, capital. HO can therefore model increasing cost. Each country's comparative advantage depends on its endowments of various inputs. In these models, inputs are called factors of production. That phrase is often shortened to just factors. The Heckscher-Ohlin model predicts that a country will have a comparative advantage at producing the products whose production is intensive in the country's abundant factor of production. Pineapples are grown in the Philippines because that country is abundant in rain and warm weather and has volcanic soil well suited to growing pineapples. Assume there are two countries, the U.S. and Canada, and there are two goods, bread and steel. Steel production requires iron ore, coking material, somewhat skilled labor, and expensive capital equipment. Bread production requires flour, water, specialized labor, and less expensive capital equipment. Steel is relatively capital intensive. Bread is relatively labor intensive. The Ricardian model assumed a single input, labor, which was mobile between the two sectors. Therefore, the PPC was linear. The HO model allows multiple inputs, labor, capital, raw materials, and so on. This model can accommodate qualitative differences between inputs. For example, a bread oven is not the same as a blast furnace used to make steel, although the blast furnace would probably bake bread very rapidly. The rate at which one input can be substituted for another is no longer constant. That implies costs are also not constant along a given PPC. If a country wants to produce more bread, it must shift resources out of steel production. The first resources that would be shifted are those that are relatively more productive at making bread. As more resources are moved from steel to bread production, they become relatively less productive than the earlier resources that were moved. As bread production rises, larger and larger quantities of steel must be given up to produce one more loaf of bread. This is a perfect description of increasing cost. With increasing cost, the PPC will be concave with respect to the origin. The rate at which steel output can be shifted to bread production is the slope of the PPC. The slope of the PPC at a specific point is the slope of a line tangent to the PPC at that point. The slope of the PPC tells us how much bread production will change for a 1-ton chain in steel production. The slope is equal to the change in the quantity of bread divided by the change in the quantity of steel at point A. You may want to review the first video from Chapter 3. The use of the CPC here is almost identical to the material presented there. Let's assume the U.S. is producing at point A on the PPC. At point A, the slope of the PPC is minus 0.67. It cost the U.S. 0.67 loaves of bread to produce one more ton of steel. Since national income equals national product, point A also shows the total U.S. income created by producing bread and steel. Point A is what the U.S. can afford to buy. Assume it costs Canada 3 loaves of bread to produce one more ton of steel, and the world price of steel is 2 loaves of bread for 1 ton of steel. Since the world price is between the U.S. price and the price in Canada, trade is possible and will benefit both countries. In the Ricardian model, each country completely specialized in production. The U.S. produced only steel, Canada produced only bread. That outcome is a direct result of the assumption that cost is constant. When costs are not constant, such a corner solution will only occur if the price of steel is less than 0.67 or greater than 3.0. Assume the CPC has a slope of minus 2. By producing at point B, the U.S. can trade up the CPC. Note that economic welfare has unambiguously improved because consumption of both goods has increased. Production at point B maximizes U.S. income because the CPC line at that point is the furthest possible from the origin. Every point on CPC prime is superior to every point on CPC and to all but one point on the U.S. PPC. At point B, the CPC and PPC have the same value. Every point on CPC prime allows consumption of more of each good than along CPC. The U.S. will consume along CPC prime and will be better off as a result. For example, the U.S. might consume at point C. This point is superior to any point on the PPC and the CPC line through point A.
Hello, welcome to Biz 113, Introduction to Business. Today we're going to be talking about international business, and the picture there is a shot of Beijing in the evening, one of the big international business centers of the world. So when we talk about international business, we can't avoid the term globalization. And globalization is a much bigger term than international business, because globalization is everything from, being able to watch a soccer game being shown live in Brazil on your computer to, being able to invest in the Canadian stock market. So all of these different concepts of globalization really boil down into these 5 concepts. We're talking about how the economies of different countries come together through trade, and we trade with Mexico, we trade with Canada, we trade with China, we trade with Japan. There's so much trade going on because that is how we get goods to market. Investment and other countries' stock markets. Capital flow from one country's residents to another country's residents. So, for example, somebody from Saudi Arabia can come in and buy an apartment in New York City for $20 or $30 million, and that money is literally staying in the U.S. So, people bring money to the country that they're emigrating or they're living in temporarily. So, if you go off to Paris or Amsterdam or London for a semester, the money that you spend in that city is the American money that your mom and dad or you have, but really what you're doing is you're bringing it to another country to buy stuff there. Labor migration, which means that certain types of jobs are more in demand in some countries than in others. So many of the folks who work for Google, Microsoft, Cisco, Apple, all of the big computer companies have immigrated from other countries, because Americans, we don't like math. I mean, I know some Americans love math, but in general, you get Americans very phobic about math, which also leads to, less of an interest in computer engineering and programming at the level that is needed. So, everybody wants to be a game developer. That sounds fun, but, the real money is in the kind of what you would consider boring applications like file compressions. If you ever watch the show Silicon Valley, their first big product that they get rich from is a compression app, which, revolutionizes the way that we can deliver digitized material. And then finally, and leading into that, is technology, which allows for the immediate communication and transfer of information. In the olden days, if a new album came out that you wanted to listen to, you had to get out of your house, get in your car, or get a ride to the store, and you would go to, Tower Records or whatever old radio record store there was, and you would stand in line and buy it, and then have to go home and play it on your LP player. I know, it's shocking, isn't it? Now, a new song comes out, you go to your iTunes or your Google Play, you download it in the next 10 seconds, and then you have it in your earbuds. It's an amazing world we live in. And yet, there's this constant, having to keep up with the technology that really causes a lot of stress as well. So we're going to specifically talk about trade because that's really where business comes into being. Trade has existed since before the beginning of civilization. So civilizations have been commonly accepted that they started to spring up somewhere between 3000 BCE and 2000 BCE. Some of the big initial civilizations, you had the Mesopotamians in what is now known as Iran, Iraq, and parts of Turkey. You had the Chinese with their great civilization. You had the folks who were living in South America, the Mayans, the Peruvians, and then, as these civilizations began to grow, and of course, let's not forget the Egyptians. Items were traded between farms, small family groupings. So a small dairy farm might trade with a small wheat farm. So you want to get some milk for your grain and grain for your milk. But then as they grew bigger and you needed to have a little bit more control over your food supply, trade became the way to make that happen. So, for example, if you had 10 people living in a community, you were only feeding 10 people. But if you had many, many, many neighbors that come together and begin to grow a lot of a certain type of product, they can then trade with other small communities. And this grew and grew on kind of an exponential scale. So the civilizations grew from these small settlements. Transportation became more sophisticated, and when we're talking about sophisticated transportation, we're talking about, waterways where you had your barges and your ships carrying goods. And this was traditionally the main method of moving a lot of product from one area to the other. So if you look in the Mesopotamian area, if you look at the Egyptian area, if you look at the Peruvian or the Chinese, or even the Indus Valley, which is in India, all of these civilizations emerged after, it was realized that these waterways provided opportunities for large-scale trade. Now, what trade did was also allowed for learning about one another. And, in addition to the ships, you also had your caravan routes, the camels and wagons that took people from place to place, which is, again, also how religion was transferred around. Muhammad, who was the prophet for Islam, was initially part of a caravan trade route, and his wife owned the caravan. So, in that context, you're seeing that knowledge, information, and trade becomes the way that society begins its globalization process. So the importance of precious metals also increased as some communities mined for gold and silver, and then traded for food and other supplies. This eventually led to the development of money, which could be used to buy and sell commodities. Because if you're walking around with a bag full of gold, any group of people who want to, knock you out or bump you on the head or hang you, are going to steal your money. So banking was a necessary way of holding on to things for people. International trade evolved throughout the last 5,000 years at a steady pace, but the Dutch in the 17th century, early 1600s, developed large-scale shipping trade routes from Europe and the Middle East to Africa and Asia, which literally opened up the world to the Dutch. And, the Dutch Golden Age, as it's often called, is how so many people around the world are familiar with, Dutch culture. It really took off in the 20th century as large container ships, and I have a picture of one of those on the right. Trucks, trains, airplanes became the most common method for trading goods. The most cost-efficient is the ship. That is just, each one of those boxes is a container box. And if you haven't watched Dexter and you don't know what a container box looks like, basically those big boxes that are on the backs of trucks. Trucks are the second least expensive, then trains, but trains are good for certain things that you don't want on your roads, like chemicals. And then finally airplanes, which we use for mail because it is the most expensive, but the fastest way to get something from A to B. In the last few years of the 20th century, as the internet became commercially available, trade was launched into a new level. Digitized files and communications with anyone else in the world could be shared in seconds. Consequently, the cost of trade significantly reduced, and trade became the number one way of bringing inventory to the marketplace. And keeping in mind this, digitization not only affects manufacturing items, but it also affects the total idea of service industry. We're going to be talking about that in more detail in a few minutes. So why is trade so important? Well, trade is dominant because no national economy produces all the goods and services that its people need. So, you wake up in the middle of February and you realize it's Valentine's Day and you have to find something to buy for your love muffin. What do? You go online and you find out that there are chocolate-covered strawberries on sale at the chocolatier near your workplace. So you book it, you set them up, you're going to bring them home to your love muffin, and they're going to love you like crazy as they're eating their chocolate-covered strawberries. It's February. Where do we get those strawberries? Well, we get them from South America where, in February, it's nice and warm down there. So, again, what we have to do is think about all those items that we want at various times that may not be, natural to our environment. So the cost of labor, the availability of natural resources, and the level of know-how vary greatly around the world. So, let's not even worry about fruit. Let's talk about natural resources in terms of what each country can bring to the table. There are certain metals that are found in high concentration in places like the Congo. And, those metals, when mined, can be sold on the open market or traded for lots and lots of money, which can support an entire country's economy, especially if it's a small country. The cost of labor. We know that the people working in factories in China and Vietnam and the Philippines don't always make the most amount of money, right? But where it's not going to stop us from buying our Nikes or our Apple computers. No, of course not. Because they have a lot of people there. And so they don't get paid as much. So the cost of living is less. That's how we validate it in our own minds. Countries are importers when they buy goods and services from other countries. Countries are exporters when they sell products to other nations. If a country sells more products than it buys, it has a favorable balance called a trade surplus. If a country buys more than it sells, it has an unfavorable balance or a trade deficit. So you can kind of think of this like a credit card. If you buy a ton of stuff for Christmas or whatever holiday you might celebrate, and you don't have cash in your account at that very moment, so you use your credit card and you run it up. And the next month, when it comes time to pay it, you have any cash. Now you're running a deficit because you have to carry that balance. Now, let's say instead that your boss gives you a really good bonus and at Christmas or whatever holiday you celebrate, and boom, now you can pay off credit card in January, and you have extra left over to take yourself on a little shopping spree. That would be the trade surplus. So when we think of trading partners for the U.S., we know China is very, very big in that world, mostly because, those of us who go into Target or Walmart or JCPenney or any of those kind of places, we see the little note or the little sign on the bottom of each product that says made in China. However, keep in mind that China is number one, but look at Canada and Mexico. Almost $600 billion each. The top three are really the numbers to look at. Then we have Japan and Germany and South Korea. Now, Japan and Germany primarily are providing us our vehicles to a large extent. South Korea, Samsung, I bet you that the vast majority of that 119 billion comes from cell phones and Samsung products. The United Kingdom, so England, Wales, Scotland, France, then India, and Italy. So when we think about our trading partners, we think about these are the folks who produce the goods we need the most. So we determine a country's balance of trade by subtracting the value of its imports from the value of its exports. The United States has had a trade deficit. We buy far more goods from the rest of the world than we sell overseas. We have very high income levels compared to the rest of the world. We are not only making more money than most other people, we are also consuming a sizable portion of the goods that are brought in, imported, as well as goods that are purchased in the that are made in the USA. You know, we like this idea of made in the USA. Other countries such as China and Taiwan, which manufacture primarily for export, have large trade surpluses because they sell far more goods than they buy. Now, here is the U.S. China trade in 2017. That very first one, computers and electronics, $167 billion. That number represents a lot of cell phones because that's where primarily most iPhones are put together. Then you have your electrical equipment, miscellaneous manufacturing, apparel, which is your clothes, machinery, furniture, fabricated metal, leather, plastic and rubber, and textiles. So the U.S. goods deficit with China in 2017 was $375 billion. Now, is that a bad thing or a good thing? Well, it's hard to say because we can't possibly make all the products that we want to buy for the amount of money the Chinese can make them for. Because we have 330 million people in our country. They have 1.3 billion people. They have a lot of labor force, which means they don't have to worry about paying a lot of money because, you know, if this person who runs this machine can't do it anymore, there are 10,000 others who can do it. And these countries also promote math, science, engineering, and computers in all of their school systems. And, you know, the culture is not about fighting with your parents necessarily and saying, I'm not going to do my homework. It's more about please. And this leads us into the whole conversation about domestic labor costs. U.S. companies manufacture products in other countries because the labor costs are lower. This arrangement is called international contract manufacturing and is also known as outsourcing. A U.S. company might contract with a local company in a foreign country to manufacture one of its products. It will retain control of product design and development and put its own label on the finished product. You may remember a couple weeks ago when we talked about some of the issues with the Chinese workers at Foxconn, which was the factory that makes Apple iPads, and how numerous individuals who worked at these companies committed suicide over working conditions. So just to kind of bring you back from where we may have heard this before, contract manufacturing is quite common in U.S. apparel and technology, with most American brands being made in a number of Asian countries, including China and India. Companies with a large manufacturing presence in other countries include Nike and Apple. So you'll see on the pictures up at the top right, there's an Apple computer being put together, and then below that is a picture of a Nike factory. Now, we had previously talked about the whole service industry, and you can't really imagine somebody being outsourced to take your order at a McDonald's, although that's very soon to come with computers. But information technology has become something that can be easily outsourced to countries with lower labor costs, especially those countries that speak English, because most Americans, of course, only have our one language. U.S. companies increasingly draw on a vast supply of relatively inexpensive, skilled labor to perform various business services such as software development, accounting, and claims processing. With a large, well-educated population with English language skills, apparently I don't have any, India has become a center for software development and customer call centers for American companies. So if you have to call, for example, Hewlett-Packard, HP, or Microsoft, there is a good chance you're going to have the phone or text or email responded to by someone named Joe, who, that is not his real name, but that is the name that he has been given. And the reason for that is how much people make. So in the United States, the average IT specialist programmer can earn approximately $35 per hour, which is about $72,000 per year. However, in India, the same job pays approximately $7.50 per hour, or $15,000 per year. So you're saving $57,000 per employee, which, if you put all of the employees together, will, more than pay for any of the costs associated with the telecommunications setup in this other country. Now, another option is called a strategic alliance, and this is an agreement between two companies, or a company and a nation, to pool resources in order to achieve business goals that benefit both partners. An alliance can serve a number of purposes. It can enhance marketing efforts. It's easier to get your product into a foreign country if there is a well-known product or a well-known manufacturer or well-known provider in that company who's willing to create a partnership with you. It builds sales and market share, improves products, reduces production and distribution costs because now you have multiple locations for producing and distributing, and sharing technology. For example, Viacom, which is a leading global media company, has a strategic alliance with Beijing Television to produce Chinese language music and entertainment programming. And you'll see there's a picture of one of the big executives at Paramount, which is a company owned by Viacom. And, so you can see that it's a natural connection between the two. Then we have foreign direct investment, and this refers to formal establishment of business operations on foreign soil, the building of factories, sales offices, and distribution networks to serve local markets in a nation other than the company's home country. German and Japanese automakers, such as BMW, Mercedes, Toyota, Honda, have made significant commitments to the U.S. market. Most of the cars and trucks that we see on the road are built in plants in the South and Midwest, and will be sold in the United States. So over here on the right is a map from Toyota Motor Company of the factories that they have in the United States and Mexico and Canada. Now you'll see that the vast majority of these states are right below the Mason-Dixon line, but also just north of it. So we see quite a bit of jobs and money coming in from Toyota to the United States. And again, this is a foreign direct investment, or an FDI. A common form of FDI is the foreign subsidiary, an independent company owned by a foreign firm, often called the parent firm. This approach gives the parent company full access to local markets, but also exempts it from any laws or regulations that may hamper the activities of foreign firms. The parent company has tight control over the operations of a subsidiary, but while senior managers from the parent company often oversee operations, the managers and employees are citizens of the host country. So if you go to Coca-Cola Japan, the Japanese are running the factories and the bottling. If you go to Coca-Cola Germany, same thing. They're making the product in Germany and bottling it in Germany. Then we have something called offshoring. And this occurs when facilities are set up in a foreign country to replace U.S. manufacturing facilities and are used to produce goods that will be sent back to the United States for sale. Shifting production to low-wage countries is often criticized as it results in the loss of jobs for U.S. workers. So, in the 1990s, when Nike was really had the majority of the sneaker or the running shoe market, they were employing almost 500,000 employees in Asian countries to create their product. The company is still based in the United States, but this offshore setup allows for following different rules and allows for using cheaper labor. And, a lot of companies are being lured to these countries because these countries are desperate for foreign investment in order to keep their economy going. So places like the British Virgin Islands, Dubai, the Bahamas, and wow, all of these places are really nice and warm to live in. So you're not seeing a lot of these offshore companies being set up in Siberia. Then we have multinational corporations. A company that operates in many countries is called the Multinational Corporation, or MNC. The American company Walmart is the largest multinational company in the world. MNCs often adjust their operations, products, marketing, and distribution to mesh with the environments of the countries in which they operate. MNCs are willing to accommodate cultural and economic differences in different markets in which they operate. So a couple cultural ones, just because that's what we're most familiar with. McDonald's makes lamb burgers in India instead of beef because cows are seen as sacred. McDonald's also offers wine as a beverage in France and beer in Germany because those two countries have much more relaxed attitudes about drinking wine and or beer. So when we think about international trade, it's not just the legal issues, the economic issues, and the technological issues. We're also looking at cultural issues. And that, in a large way, is one of the most significant issues in doing business internationally, is learning about these other cultures so you are not offensive. So culture is a system of shared beliefs, values, customs, and behaviors that govern the interactions of members of a society. Cultural differences create challenges to successful international business dealings. And so it's really important that you do your research before you go off to a country to do business. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, having somebody see the bottom of your shoe could be insulting. In other countries, certain, like the peace sign that we use in the U.S., used in a certain way in England, is the equivalent of a FU. So again, these are all things that you have to pay attention to when you're doing international business. Language, however, is probably the most obvious example of these differences. So when Kentucky Fried Chicken opened their first restaurant in China, the restaurant had accidentally translated its infamous slogan, "Finger lickin' good," to a not so appetizing, "Eat your fingers off." Ford Motor Cars launched an ad campaign in Belgium that execs thought said, "Every car has a high-quality body." However, when translated, the slogan read, "Every car has a high-quality corpse," because you always want a corpse in your trunk. Coors Beer directed its young adult ad campaign in America to Spain. Their Turn It Loose campaign, which is about attracting, the young, cool kids, they forgot to resonate or to translate in a more idiomatic way, because turn it loose, when translated into Spanish, is interpreted as suffer from diarrhea. And that's really not what you want from your beer. So, one of the best ways to combat this problem is to study the foreign languages you may be in business with, such as Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, and Arabic. Most people appreciate some effort to communicate in their local language, even on the most basic level. You walk into a store in France, you say bonjour, even if that's the only word you know, because that's why they hate certain type of American tourists, because we don't even try sometimes. The same principle goes doubly when you're introducing yourself to non-English speakers in the United States. So keep in mind that this is not just about traveling off to Dubai or Brazil, but rather you're also having to interact with folks at your company in the U.S. So if they're bringing a programmer in from China or India that's going to be working on a project, you should learn a few words in Mandarin Chinese. Few things work faster to encourage a friendly atmosphere than a native speaker's willingness to greet a foreign guest in the guest's native language. So here are the most commonly spoken languages in the world on the right. So we have Chinese, and again, there's 1.3 billion Chinese. So, and when we think of Chinese, there's 2 or 3 different main variations, but there are hundreds of dialects. So we're just going to call it Chinese. Hindu, or Urdu, which is what native Indians will not Native American Indians, but native Indians often speak, but most Indians also learn English. Arabic, Spanish, Russian, Bengali, which is right next to India, Portuguese, which is spoken in Brazil, by the way, German, Japanese, French, and Italian. And also, very important, remember that each culture has their own nonverbal language as well. So, in some countries, you don't shake hands, you bow. The depth of your bow will indicate their level of respect. There are some people who, don't interact with women because in their country, women are not in the business world. Other people will use the namaste bow and are waiting for you to respond. And then, of course, some people stand really, really close to you, and that makes you also feeling uncomfortable. So the non-verbal language issue is just as important as the verbal one. So talking about that social distance concept, we like to keep our distance from others, and there are very specific social rules about how close we get to others in particular situations. This social distance is also known as body space and comfort zone, and the use of this space is called prometric. In business environments, the average amount of space varies by culture. In North America, we like 18 inches. Measure from your shoulder to the end of your fingers, and that's about 18 inches, give or take, depending on how long your arm is. But, you want an arm's length away. Western Europe, slightly closer. The closer you get to the Mediterranean, Spain, Italy, the closer people are going to be standing to one another. Japan, they want a bubble of 3 feet around them at all times. And then in the Middle East, they tend to stand very, very close together. In general, research has shown that people who live in warm climates demand less personal space, interestingly enough. So some other elements that you have to understand in terms of international business and how culture affects it are going to be discussed on the next several slides. First, we have this concept of uncertainty avoidance, which is the cultural mindset that indicates how tolerant a culture is of uncertainty and change. So cultures that are high in uncertainty avoidance, meaning they want to avoid uncertainty, they like predictability, and they don't like to take risks. A country like Japan is considered very high on this scale. Cultures that are low in uncertainty avoidance see change as a way to achieve progress. They are high risk takers, and the USA falls into this category. Another aspect is how we see power. In the United States, we've been taught to always question authority. Benjamin Franklin said, "It is the responsibility of every citizen to question authority." So we have a low respect for power. We have what we call low power distribution because we believe power should be equally distributed. People question authority, and government is based on democratic ideals. In other countries, power and the distribution of power is being given great respect. You never question authority. The hierarchy is clearly established and accepted in society. So a country like North Korea and the picture on the right are people who are bowing in respect to a statue of their dictator, Kim Jong-il. Or Kim Jong-un. I forget who's in charge these days. But most importantly, we don't like to bow or to, respect. Then we have masculine and feminine something that's really foreign. And this concept is based on certain stereotypical we would never go up to the that are associated with masculine statue in Philadelphia and make masculine culture focuses on achievement, competitiveness, action, strength, and material success. We're more likely to put his hand in our butt, Mexico, and take a picture and giggle. Women, I'm not saying have a very minor love that kind of stuff. So again, you could go to some of the countries where women don't even leave their house unaccompanied, like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran. Iran's liberalizing a little bit more, but and then work is more important than family. And a lot of people would argue that the U.S. has a lot of masculine characteristics. Now, the feminine culture focuses on sexual equality, meaning men and women are equal, nurturance, quality of life, supportiveness, affection, and compassion. We see the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, as leading the way in this kind of culturation. Women are heavily engaged in politics, and family work-life balance is stressed. And they do say that the more women you have in politics, the more likely a work-life balance will be incorporated into the culture. And, part of that is women are still considered necessary for raising a family because you can't really get babies out of a test tube yet. Then we have individualism and collectivism. Individualism focuses on self-concept and personal achievement and prefers competition over cooperation, individual over group, private over public, and the United States is a perfect example. We have this image of cowboys, how the West was won, and their lone men, roaming around on their horses, being manly and carrying guns and doing everything that manly men do. And that, to us, was the quintessential American folk hero. Now, the reality, of course, we know is much different. But on the other side of the coin is a collectivist perspective, which focuses on the group, its norms, values, beliefs, over the individual self. The success of the group is more important than personal success. Maintaining a positive relationship is more important than completing a task. Personal transgressions leads to feelings of shame. So you see this a lot in Asian countries and in some South American countries. This picture over here on the right of the dragon, which is a common visual representation of Chinese and Japanese iconographics in the same way that the American cowboy represents the U.S. And what you see is 5 individuals, each holding up a basket of product or something. And again, that represents that collectivist idea, whereas the cowboy who just needs his gun and his horse to make him happy. So, cultural context is another important aspect because you need to understand whether or not the message has some implicit or some subtextual meaning. So high context cultures, or a lot of subtext, you have a lot of similarity among the members in that group. The meaning of a message is drawn from context rather than from words. The meaning is implied, like it's coded. And you see this a lot in large groups of people who've immigrated to a certain area, or smaller communities where everybody has they're in on the same joke. So, for example, Filipinos, southern U.S., once someone from the South says bless her heart or bless his heart, you're being insulted. And that's why it's hilarious. The Irish have a million inside jokes. They could say somebody's clever, and that's a biggest insult. It's all in the way they say it. And then Africa, which also there's a lot of context or codes embedded in the culture. So if you look at this picture on the right-hand side, all the way to the right, these higher context, Asia, Arabs, Southern Europeans, Africans, South Americans, we're talking a lot of people who can draw information from a message that it doesn't necessarily involve the words, but involves the circumstances. Then we have our low context, meaning there's not a lot of hidden messages, if there's any. There's a high degree of difference among members, meaning everybody is very individualistic. And as such, you have to spell the message out explicitly, make it clear, and it should be in writing or at least verbally explained. So, example, Germany, most of the United States, in terms of the idea that you get out of the South and you go into Michigan or the East Coast, Philadelphia, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and people are very clear. I want this. They don't use a lot of subtext. Israel and Australia are also countries where you see a much lower context. People are much more explicit in what they're looking for. Americans are monochronic. Time is rigidly adhered to and deadlines are respected. In South America and Africa, time is polychronic. People are less concerned with punctuality. Lateness is normal, and it's not considered rude. So, some attitudes that you'll see based on the culture in which you are. In monochronic attitudes, time is money. You waste time, you waste money. Deadlines are sacred. You should never try to reschedule because that's considered rude. Getting the job done fast is the most important thing. Remember that effective, efficient concept that, we talked about all the way back in week 1. On the other hand, polychronic attitudes, there's always enough time to have a chit-chat. Relationship building is more important. Deadlines are a suggestion. Rescheduling's not a big deal. Life happens, we know. So kind of a more fatalistic attitude. And developing good working relationships is the most important thing. So, these attitudes are very indicative of how you need to act if you're going to be meeting with these folks. So if somebody from South Africa keeps you waiting an extra half hour, that's not rude, that's just their way of doing things. On the other hand, you go to a monochronic country like Germany and you keep them waiting, they're not going to be happy. So, one of the things that's been in the news a lot are tariffs. And tariffs are taxes on imports. Tariffs are also called customs, import duties, or import fees. Because they raise the price of foreign-made goods, these higher prices give an advantage to domestic products within the same market. They are used to protect a nation's industry. So, for example, the United States protects domestic makers of synthetic knitted shirts by imposing a stiff tariff of 32.5% on imports. When one country significantly increases tariffs on another country or other countries, these other countries usually retaliate and impose their own tariffs. Over time, tariffs reduce business for all countries. So here's a picture of how a tariff works. So in Britain, the Brits make cloth that costs $4 a roll. To export it to the United States, there's a 25% tariff on that $4, which is $1. So it is sold in the United States for $5. That same type of cloth, which is made in America, then costs $4 a roll. So the idea here is that that extra dollar will oftentimes make people buy the less expensive American-made item. However, when you get into the way that labor costs go, oftentimes that tariff doesn't do much to mitigate the lower prices because the tariff just makes them competitive with American pricing and not overwhelmingly expensive. On average, tariffs are around 5%. Countries charge different tariff rates depending on the industry they are protecting. Countries can waive tariffs when they have free trade agreements with each other, such as Nafta, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was signed in 1994, and this binds Mexico, the U.S., and Canada in a free trade agreement with one another. And this chart is from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and this is the top 10 states that benefit from NAFTA in 2017. And these are the number of jobs. So California, over 500,000 jobs. Texas, almost 400,000 jobs. New York, 300,000. Florida, over 250,000. Illinois, 211. Oh, Pennsylvania, that's the state we're in, 206,000, and so on and so forth. So what you see here is about 5 million jobs total come from this trade agreement. So most economists see trade agreements as a very beneficial concept. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, please email or text me. If you do not go to our school but are still having questions, please feel free to leave me a comment in the comment section of the YouTube page. And otherwise, have a fantastic day.
Now let's consider something called the gravity equation, and this is aimed toward trying to understand why the costs of trade are often so high. We have something called the gravity equation in physics, and this is stipulating, among other things, that the further away two objects are from each other, the weaker the attraction. For economics, our gravity equation is going to say the further away are two countries, the weaker the trade attraction. Now let's consider a very simple form of a gravity equation, just so you get a sense of how it works. On the left-hand side, we have trade, which is what we're trying to explain. That's the quantity of trade, and it's between nations I and nations J, as represented by the subscripts here. On the right-hand side, you can, in simple versions, treat this G as a simple constant. On top, you have M sub I times M sub J. Think of that as the size of one economy multiplied by the size of the other. So in general, in gravity equations, the larger the economies you're dealing with, the less distance is going to matter. And then on the bottom, we have D, the all-important distance, and that's the distance between country I and country J, again represented by the subscript here. As distance increases, trade does go down, but in more complicated forms of a gravity equation, this is often something exponential, so you could imagine it being d squared or d to the 1.25 or whatever, and those would indicate that as distance increases, the possibility of trade is increasingly decaying, the costs of trade are becoming increasingly larger at a faster rate. Empirically, consider this graph here. The horizontal axis is basically telling you how large a country is in economic terms. The vertical axis is basically telling you how much that country trades with the United States. As shown here, well, which are the two countries trading the most with the United States? There is Canada and there is Mexico. But if you ask how large are those economies, well, they're not especially large compared to a lot of other places. Why are they trading so much with the United States? Well, it seems at least one big reason is because they are so close. If you're wondering how gravity approaches fit into the broader picture of international trade, they are actually consistent with a lot of different international trade theories, such as increasing returns or the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. So finding for the importance of gravity doesn't rule out the relevance of any of these theorems, but still it can be said to the extent that gravity theories of trade matter, that means an underlying model of international trade probably does require some specialization, because if trade costs are really that high, well, then you need specialization to be getting trade off the ground at all. And let's take a look at just how high the costs of trade seem to be in the gravity literature, and let's start with industrialized countries. To take one known estimate, again for developed nations, from Anderson and Wynkoop, the costs of trade across borders are on average about 170%. Of that sum, they estimate that about 21% is transportation costs, about 44% is border-related costs, having to deal with paperwork or bureaucracy or tariffs or different cultures or different regulatory standards. And indeed, breaking down that 44%, they find 8% a policy barrier, 7% a language barrier, 14% a different currency barrier, 6% an information cost barrier, 3% a security barrier. But again, these are just averages. These are examples giving you one way of thinking about where some of these gravity costs come from. Finally, again, according to Anderson and Wynkoop, 55% of that 170% is coming from retail and wholesale margins as trade crosses barriers. And by the way, if you're wondering how that all adds up, you can see it's given by this equation here. One quite striking result we learned from the gravity literature is that overall, tariffs are a relatively small barrier to trade, especially once we get past agriculture or outside of the very most protectionist countries such as North Korea. Overall, most of the costs of international trade come from other obstacles in having to cross borders. And you'll note those numbers come from developed countries, which on average tend to be more efficient and better at trading. For developing countries, trade costs can actually be at least 2 times higher. We also find empirically that trade costs vary with the product line, and they can vary by a factor of 10 or more. It really does depend what you're trading, and these numbers are just estimates, just averages. Early in this video, we offered a very simple form of a gravity equation, but actually the more accurate forms of gravity equation define distance costs relative to available alternatives. So let's consider a comparison here using data from the 1990s, and on one side of the comparison stands Australia and New Zealand, and on the other stands Austria and Portugal, both of course in Europe. Comparing these 4 nations, well, Australia and New Zealand are roughly the same distance apart as are Austria and Portugal. Furthermore, if you're taking the product of the size of the economies or the GDPs, again, this comparison you will get something pretty close to equality. And yet there's quite a striking truth here. In 1993, Australia-New Zealand trade is about 9 times greater than the trade between Portugal and Austria. Why is that? Well, Austria and Portugal are both located in Europe, and they have nearby a lot of other countries to trade with. Australia and New Zealand are much more isolated, relatively speaking, in the Pacific, and thus they end up trading much more with each other because they have fewer other natural trade partners. Here's the comparison. Let's take within the United States the average of state-to-state trade, and we're going to divide that by the average state-to-province trade, where by province we mean Canadian province, and on average that figure is about 1.5. So that means a given U.S. state is more likely to be trading with another U.S. state than with a Canadian province, but only by about 50%. From a Canadian perspective, a similar ratio will look quite different. So let's take the average province-to-province trade, and this is within Canada, and divide that by the average state, meaning U.S. state, to Canadian province trade. And there the ratio is much larger. It's quite striking. It's going to be 16.4 times higher. That is, a given Canadian province is way more likely to be trading with another Canadian province than with a U.S. state. But why are these two ratios so different? Consider some comparative statics. Say we start with a case where there are no costs of trade at all across borders, and then we introduce some kind of trade barrier which makes it harder to consummate these exchanges. As a result, both Canada and the United States would trade more with themselves, that is, they would trade more internally rather than exporting and importing, but in proportional terms, this is going to be a larger effect for the smaller, more open economy, namely Canada. This is part of a broader and more general truth that simply any increase in trade costs will have a larger impact on the smaller and more open countries. Let's think this through with a simple example using tourists. Here's the U.S.-Canada border as represented at Niagara Falls. Right now it's pretty easy to cross that border, but let's say it became a lot more difficult. The lines were longer, or a passport cost more to get, or security procedures would be tougher. How would this have differential effects on the United States and Canada? Well, the United States is a larger economic unit, so it's the case that in proportional terms, we have more United States citizens taking their vacations already within the United States. So if passport costs go up, this has a moderate effect, but actually tourist sites in the United States do not become that much more crowded. Canada is a smaller and more open economy, so proportionally speaking, more of its citizens are traveling abroad. As passport costs go up, more of those citizens stay in Canada, and that will make Canadian tourist sites much more crowded. So here we have higher passport costs, meaning that Canada gets much more internal tourism, or you could say much more internal trade, and the higher passport costs mean the United States, the larger country economically speaking, is only getting a bit more internal tourism and a bit more internal trade. That's all just another way of thinking about how the gravity equation works. Another way to put this is simply to note that in more sophisticated forms of the gravity equation, relative trade barriers are what matter, not just absolute distance. For core readings on the gravity equation and how it's applied, I would very much recommend all of these sources, the bottom being you can simply Google gravity equation trade. Here are also some other reasons on the gravity equation approach. These are important articles, but they're also more technical or more difficult, and I would recommend them only to more advanced students of this topic.